All right. Well, thank you for having me. I actually just presented this to a group in the Inland Empire earlier today. I was very rushed there, and I'm going to be very rushed here because there's a lot to go through. And this was originally like a 50 slide presentation that I gave to ULI LA last month, but I didn't want to make it quite that long. And so I think with this group, you're going to be a little more up to speed already. There's some things I won't really have to explain, I think. But I will start with a little background on this. Or actually, maybe the way back background is that I wrote a report calling for transfer tax reform way back in 2020 in the city of Los Angeles, specifically to enact something that was broad and progressive and graduated, that exempted new development, because even then it was known that you could have negative effects on housing production and other kinds of development if you were taxing recently completed projects. Um, and then, a couple, well, actually, that same year, Alex Fish in the city of Culver City put forth an initiative to create a transfer tax there. And that one followed most of the recommendations I included in my report, including that exemption for new multifamily and a pretty broad base. The tax starts to increase at $1.5 million and goes up from there. Um, Here in Los Angeles, as everyone knows, we passed one in 2022, and that was developed throughout 2022 by a group of mostly affordable housing developers and labor. And that one, sorry, missing something here. There we go. The design of that is it's a 4% tax on sales over $5 million and under $10 million, and a 5.5% tax on sales $10 million and over, with inflation adjustments each year. There's not a lot of exemptions, but the exemptions that do exist are basically for nonprofit affordable housing developers. And the revenues go toward affordable housing construction. About 45%, up to 45% goes toward that. And most of the rest goes toward things like rental assistance and right to counsel and homeless services, kind of the services side of things. So I had, in that 2020 report, a variety of recommendations for how you should structure this. It should be broad, meaning many people end up paying it at the end of the day. Progressive. So this is just like where ULA stands relative to those recommendations. It's not broad because it starts at $5 million, and that only represents 3% of sales or so, real estate sales. It is progressive. It goes up as the value of the property goes up. It's not very graduated. It's just got two brackets above the 0.45% base. Ideally, you would have more and kind of stepping up more gradually. It's not marginal, so it is possible to pay more on a smaller sale value. So, if you sell for $5.5 million or $5 million in one, you would pay a $200,000 tax. If you if you sold it for 4.99 million, you would pay no tax at all. So you're actually worse off at a higher value. And that's kind of a flaw with non-marginal taxes. And it's not very well targeted. It applies, as I said, to most properties, and it does not exempt. It makes no kind of effort at trying to not deter new development of any kind. uh, I ended up supporting this still. I voted for it still. And, I think it's important, just not for my own, defense, but just to understand how this all came about. Um, I think there are, valid reasons for why it ended up the way it did. A broader tax might not gain enough support. I think it got about 55% support. So it had a healthy margin of pro voters. But, you could imagine if suddenly you're getting into the $1 million, $1.5 million, where like the median home support might fall pretty significantly. And if a tax isn't very broad, if it starts at $5 million, there's not a lot of room for stepping it up gradually. And lots of taxes, unfortunately, are not marginal, especially at the local level. They are kind of confusing to explain, even though they're not that, complicated. And this is kind of irrelevant here, but I had an idea in the 2020 report that you might target properties that had lower effective tax rates at time of sale because of Prop 13 for higher percentages. So that, of course, was not done. But the question about taxes on new development, it's it's not clear what the effect of that would be. We had concerns about it, but I'd done some analysis in 2022 that was incomplete, but suggested that it might not be such a big deal. But by 2023, 2024, it was pretty clear from, if not quite the data just yet, just hearing from developers how it was affecting them. It seemed pretty obvious that there were problems. And so that was really the motivation for this. Partly, it was my own way of making up for supporting this thing that has had some negative consequences. So it's important to understand why ULA might depress housing production. I think a lot of people hear a 4% or a 5.5% tax and think like, how could that possibly turn a project into something that's infeasible? You pay a similar amount to your like broker, right, when a property is sold. So why is this such a big problem? Especially if you are going to buy a property and land is maybe 20% of your total development cost. So that a 4 or 5.5% tax is adding 1% to your cost if you end up building and then not selling, because you're not going to pay the tax on that completed project if you just own it and operate it. If you do sell, it's going to add another 4 or 5.5% tax on top of that. And that is certainly either of these really on the margins are enough to shift some projects from a go to a no-go, but not necessarily a lot. The other, I think, more sophisticated way of looking at this, or so people might say, maybe you can just fix this problem by charging more. But of course, the market rate is what the market rate is. You can't just increase the cost of your rent or sale price because your costs have gone up. You might be able to reduce your expenses somehow, but you can't really increase your revenues. And so that's not really a feasible response to, paying for this tax. But people do ask, can't you just pay less for the land? You can't increase your revenues, you can't really reduce your costs, but you can just pay the land owner who you're getting it, the person you're getting the land from, less money, and that's kind of where you can have that savings. The problem here is that if you're going to pay a tax on the final product of your final development, that 4 or 5.5% tax, then you're actually reducing the amount you can pay for land by anywhere from 25 to 40%. And so you can imagine a case where I'm not going to use the numbers here because I haven't looked at them recently, but say you have a property that a developer might pay $10 million for. It's like a strip mall property, has good zoning, but it has existing use that is useful to someone. Someone might just be willing to pay $8 million to buy that and operate it, maybe fix it up a little bit, but just keep it as a strip mall. As things stand pre-ULA, the developer can pay 10 million. They're going to win the bid. They're going to redevelop the property. We're going to get the housing or whatever was going to be built on that land. After ULA, if they have to reduce what they can pay by $2.5 million or more, they can't pay any more than $7.5 million. And now they're always going to lose that bid. And that strip mall is going to stay a strip mall. And so that's one way that ULA can reduce the amount of development that happens. There's also more complicated issues with financing and so forth, where, as a bank, if you are looking to loan money out, even if the developer does not intend to sell and therefore does not expect to pay that tax, you are looking at things from the worst case perspective. And if their project fails and you have to take ownership of it, you're going to sell it and you're going to pay that tax. And so you still have to budget it into the project, and that causes a lot of projects to not go forward. So I think that's all just important context for why this might be a problem. And we did, of course, see permitting in the city of Los Angeles fall really sharply in 2023 after the tax went into effect in April, and again in 2024. So from about 14,000 in 2022 multifamily units specifically, down to under 9,000 multifamily units in 2024. That's the first year that ADUs actually passed permitting for multifamily, which is not a good milestone. And so, can we be sure that Measure ULA is to blame? Not just by looking at that chart. As we all know, around the same time, interest rates were rising sharply, labor and materials costs also increased. permitting was falling everywhere. This was not just a Los Angeles phenomenon, and it had been only 2 years, and so it is tough to see impacts that early. So how we approached this analysis was first, we want to see if the reduction in the city of Los Angeles was greater than the reduction in other cities in Los Angeles that did not enact progressive transfer tax or increase their transfer tax at the same time. Theoretically, we should all be experiencing essentially the same trends within LA County. And so if you see that the decline in the city of Los Angeles post April 2023 is larger than the decline in other cities in Los Angeles County that didn't increase their transfer tax, but the trends prior to April 2023 were similar, then that is very strong evidence, bordering, it is arguably causal evidence that ULA is responsible for the decline, the difference in the decline between LA and these other jurisdictions. So we use various data to do this. This is really kind of the key image on or figure on the sales side of things. So we identified parcels in the city of Los Angeles and about a dozen other cities in LA County, the ones that basically have a significant amount of multifamily zoning and development. And we show that prior to ULA, they were on a very similar trend in terms of the sales of these parcels that have multifamily zoning that are worth over $5 million, that had relatively low intensity uses, et cetera. And then post ULA, the city of LA fell much more sharply, and it has continued to be about as low relative to these other LA County cities. It has not, that gap has not closed. So what this works out to is about a 50% decline in Los Angeles above and beyond the decline that was experienced by these other cities in LA County. And these are just other figures showing the same thing with regressions and so forth. But, as I said, we're looking at the sale of high value parcels that have multifamily zoning and low intensity uses. That doesn't necessarily tell us that sales of parcels that will become new housing are lower, because many of these parcels never end up becoming, they're never redeveloped. Even though they have the potential, a higher potential than most still are not redeveloped. So it's possible that all of this decline or most of this decline that we're observing is just in parcels that were never going to become new multifamily housing anyway. So in this case, we narrowed our focus. Well, the first step is what I've already talked about, but the next step is we actually tie these sales to permits. So we look at for all of these parcels that sold, we look within 1 year at any permits that were filed for them. And only about a quarter or so of units that end up permitted on a parcel that is sold actually are permitted within the first year. So we have to multiply the number by about 4 and just math things that happen. But long story short, we do show that the parcels that we're selling before and after are linked to development, and the overall amount of development, the number of units that are being permitted month to month, is on a downward trend when it was not prior to Measure ULA. And what this works out to is about a 50% reduction in units permitted on multifamily parcels. And that works out to around 1,910 units fewer being permitted per year that we would expect to be permitted. This is not kind of backward looking. This is more actually forward looking, where we're going to expect more of this to materialize or be visible in the future rather than over the past 2 years. And a few important things to note here. One is that this is just these parcels that we identified as having strong multifamily development potential. That is not all parcels that get redeveloped. This is also only parcels that were sold. Many parcels are just redeveloped by people who have owned them for many years. Either the person themselves redevelops or they partner with a developer and redevelop it without selling it. So those are just being missed entirely, which is why a 50% reduction only equates to 1,900 units when we had, 14,000 units in 2022, for example. This is also in 20 unit and larger projects. So this is just total multifamily units. We also estimate that about 170 of those are actually deed restricted affordable units, units reserved for people with low incomes, mostly extremely low incomes, because many of these projects are TOC projects that mostly include extremely low income units, just because the incentives really point you in that direction. And we just do some basic, assumptions to arrive at that number, saying about 80% of these multifamily units are likely to be in mixed income projects, and at least 11% of them on average are going to be income restricted. So I won't bother with this. I kind of covered that already. So far there's been ULA has been raising about it has gotten to around $300 million a year. It's much lower than projected initially, but it is increasing, and I would expect it to continue increasing. Um, so that's very significant. But I think one could argue that the loss of 2,000 units a year might outweigh that entire benefit. But you don't really have to make that argument, and we're not making that argument. We are not saying that the problem is ULA as a whole. We're saying it's the parts of ULA or part of ULA that discourages multifamily development. And that is just the part that applies to recently built projects. So the way we think about that is projects that were built within 50 or sold within 15 years of being built. If you have a project that was built 30 years ago, then what's built is built. You're not going to tear it down just because you have to pay a 5% tax. You might not build something because you have to pay a 5% tax. If you don't have to pay that tax for 15, 20 plus years, you're also not going to be very heavily deterred, just because the value of that tax at that point is far enough in the future. It just does not have much value. Most pro formas are only for 10 years. You're expecting to usually sell within a year or so of stabilizing the project. It might happen in the first 2 or 3 years, and then maybe there will be one more sale 10 or so years later. And that's kind of the cycle every 7 to 10 years or so. So the question is not, is this is the loss of these units so bad that it is, worse than the $300 million a year? Is it worse than whatever we're getting from taxing these new projects? And there we find that the new projects are getting us very, very little. So I don't know if people can see my mouse, but the lower of these two in the yellow box here, this is the percent of revenue for ULA if the tax had been in place and didn't change behavior, and post ULA. And what we see is multifamily that's 15 or fewer years old accounts for only 8% of revenues. Commercial and industrial that's fewer than 18 years old accounts for only 5%. So we're talking in total, 13% of revenues are coming from new multifamily commercial and industrial. This all comes, by the way, from sales data that we also linked to assessor data. So this is just a visualization of that. So a takeaway from this is, and we frame this in terms of income restricted units because for a variety of reasons. One, some people just don't care about market rate units. They should, but they don't. Another is that Measure ULA is pretty clear about its purposes, and market rate housing and housing affordability generally is not really mentioned. It's all about, low income people. It's about low income units. And so we wanted to really focus on that in this analysis. But of course, these market rate units, the loss of them has, massive costs in terms of rents and prices going up more quickly because it worsens the housing shortage. They produce property taxes and other taxes that we're just not going to get. Places for people to live are important. So I think there's plenty of reasons to be concerned about the market rate, but we focus on this is why we focus on the income restricted. If we assume that the average cost of these new units that are subsidized by Measure ULA is $672,000, which comes from some recent work by my co-author on this, and that 60% of that cost is paid with subsidies, the rest is just a loan that will be paid back. And we assume that the ULA money is not leveraging additional money because low-income housing tax credit and other sources are basically fully subscribed. So any money that Measure ULA pours in is unlikely to be matched by additional dollars. So with those two assumptions in mind, we find that taxing newer multifamily or the 8% raised by ULA on these new multifamily projects is only enough to subsidize about 70 additional units per year. And at this point, I think the 672,000 number is conservative. It's quite a bit higher for a variety of reasons right now from everything I've heard. What that means is the tax on these newer projects is actually producing a net reduction in new multifamily income restricted units of about 100 units per year. And as this shows, even if we assume that the per unit subsidy is half for these ULA funded projects, then we're still at a slight deficit. Almost coming to the end here, I think it's important to be clear about how to interpret the findings, at least how I interpret these. What I think they don't or can't say is that ULA as a whole is doing more harm than good, or that ULA is reducing the supply of affordable housing in the city. Remember that ULA, 92% of the revenue comes from the taxing other things. And so, those dollars are also subsidizing a lot of homes. I don't think it says necessarily that ULA can only be fixed by abolishing it or making it a true mansion tax. Really anything where we're going to make conclusions about ULA as a whole, I don't think that is something you can take from this report or that I would want you to. What I think this analysis does show is that ULA is reducing sales of parcels that have strong multifamily development potential, that reduction is caused by ULA and it's above and beyond the declines we've seen in other cities. The reduction in sales is associated with reduction in actual permits, and that includes many income restricted units, and that exempting the sale of newer multifamily projects would likely increase overall production, not only of market rate units, but actually of income restricted units as well, because we would get almost all of the income restricted units that are being built with Measure ULA, plus we would restore most, if not all, of the units that are being lost from taxing new projects with Measure ULA. So the recommendations we come away with from this are, we think that multifamily buildings should be exempt from Measure ULA within 15 years of construction when they're sold. If they're sold more than once, so be it. They're still exempt until that 15 years is up. We do not think this should be limited to mixed income projects. We think fully market rate buildings have plenty of benefits themselves. And in the city of LA specifically, they actually pay a linkage fee if they're not including affordable units. So they're already paying for affordable housing anyway, plus the other benefits we've already talked about. I actually think, and we do say this in the report, that we should exempt commercial and industrial projects too. Job growth is important. They also produce property taxes. And, I don't think there's going to be a lot of commercial or industrial development over the next 5 or so years anyway. So why would we be creating additional, barriers to doing that? It just doesn't make much sense. I think in both cases, both multifamily and commercial and industrial, we're going to raise very, very little money from these projects, period, even if we continued building them. And because this tax is deterring development of some of these projects, we actually would likely expect the share of revenue coming from them to decline over time. And we think that LA City Council and the state legislature have a role to play here. So I'm not going to spend time on this, but LA City Council just has limited authority. They can do some things, but there's just a really important role for the state as well. The state can do more. It can go more broadly in terms of what it exempts and so forth. And LA is not the only city that has a flawed transfer tax law. Santa Monica and San Francisco have actually very similar measures. And this would, a state law would also prevent bad actors from passing things like this intentionally to intentionally deter development in the future, or people doing their best in good faith passing something like this, but still having this effect. So those are kind of the key takeaways for us. I will add one more thing. There's a whole other report So this was myself and Jason Ward that worked on this. He's at the Rand Corporation. Mike Manville at UCLA, my colleague, and Mott Smith at the Council of Infill Builders have a whole other report that is more focused on the property tax implications of Measure ULA. And the main takeaways from that really are just that Measure ULA is reducing sales of high value properties overall of all types. And because of Prop 13, the sale of properties that have not changed hands for quite a while is the major source of property tax growth in Los Angeles, certainly, probably just about everywhere in the state. And so, to some extent, there is a cannibalization happening where you are reducing property tax revenue that is divided between the city, county, and schools and turning it into transfer tax money that only goes to the city. We're raising much more transfer tax money than it is believed we're reducing property tax revenue, something like 15 to 1 or so. But the one challenge with the property tax issue is that it can compound over time. So if we're losing $25 million a year, which is roughly what they estimate in property tax revenues, and those properties continue not to sell, then you're going to have $50 million the next year and 75 the year after that. I don't think it would quite be so linear. I think it would probably slow down a little bit as the number gets larger because some of those older ones probably will sell eventually. But it is still a very real issue. And again, that's actually another reason that I think the state is interested in this and already has a bill proposed by Buffy Wicks to at least exempt newer multifamily. I think there's a real concern here that this is taking away money from other jurisdictions and they really have no say in it. So I think that's the fixes to that are a little more severe probably. So I don't know exactly where that's going to go. But I just wanted to bring that up because I think that's another important thing to consider with all of this. Questions?